Welcome to ESG Decoded, where we navigate the evolving landscape of environmental, social, and governance, ESG. Join me, Amanda Kuhl, and Erika Schiller as we explore the intersection of sustainability, innovation, and ethical leadership.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to ESG Decoded. My name is Erika Schiller, and I'll be your host today. Joining me is Wolfgang Brückner. He's the managing director at First Climate Solutions. Wolfgang has been in the climate and carbon project development space for about 15 years and is based in Hamburg, Germany. Wolfgang, we'd love if you could share a little bit about First Climate and what you all do there.
Thanks, Erika, and thanks for having me on the podcast. Yeah, First Climate is actually one of the pioneers in the voluntary carbon market space in Europe. Actually, this year, having its 25th anniversary, so really founded in 1999. Yeah, we are supporting clients, especially in the Central European region, in Germany and Switzerland and in Austria, on their way to net zero. And it basically starts with the analysis of carbon footprints and impacts on climate on the one hand. It's about finding strategies how to decarbonize own value chains, but also providing, of course, access to compensation solutions, to early stage investments, to projects that reduce emissions outside of the own value chain that we call emission reduction projects. And we also support these clients in fulfilling their reporting obligations under the several schemes that are available on the market and internationally.
Great. Thanks, Wolfgang. And, since you're based in Europe, I wanted to ask about the European Union's carbon removal framework. There have been some recent announcements about that, and it'd be helpful if you could explain a little bit about what that framework is and if there's a timeline around it.
Yeah, it's actually quite an exciting development, what's going on in the European Union. The framework you are referring to is the so-called carbon removal certification framework. And that is a framework that actually the first globally that really defines carbon removals within the jurisdiction. And is really set to provide legal definitions of carbon removals on the one hand, and also how to use these removals in the context of the broader EU climate policy. Climate policy is very much driven by EU legislation within the European Union. And I think the overarching policy framework is the so-called European Green Deal, which intends to have Europe climate neutral by 2050. And in order to reach this goal, apparently several measures are needed. And this is one of the measures that is supposed to help to decarbonize Europe, to stipulate basically, or to stimulate removal measures within Europe, within the boundaries of the European Union, and that ultimately help to contribute to the goal.
Okay, so there's a few different tools you're saying as part of this Green Deal. There was a tool of the European Union ETS, the emissions trading scheme. So that's trying to kind of cap and trade similar to California. There's the carbon border adjustment mechanism, or CBAM, that's trying to basically ensure that the products that are imported into Europe are also reflective of some kind of price on carbon. So how does this framework fit into these other programs? It's the removals that aren't available to reduce. It's for those hard to decarbonize, or?
Yeah, exactly. Well, the ones that you mentioned, the EU ETS, it only covers around 50% of the emissions within the European Union. And that is, as you rightly said, it's a cap and trade system. So it's a possibility for policymakers to basically define how much emissions you want to have within the sectors and the scopes that are covered under this EU ETS. And thereby you can basically drive down the emissions in these sectors. But it will not be enough. It's only, as I said, covering 50%. And because of that, only 50%, of course, we need measures also for the other sectors. The consequence is simply that we do have a set of policy measures also on national and subnational level that help to decarbonize, but also other European legislations. And one of them is, for example, as well, the so-called LULUCF, Land Use Change and Forestry policy package, which basically is contributing towards decarbonizing Europe until 2030 with 310 million tons. And there are others. And the carbon removal certification framework is just complementing to that, specifically for the removal sector. And it basically covers hard to abate sectors. It's really about concentrating on removals, on long-term durable removals, and therefore the included project activities or types of projects have also been already defined now in the first set, which is basically targeting the so-called direct air carbon and capture and storage, DACs, or bioenergy carbon capture and storage, which we call BACs, and biochar when looking at the more durable removals. On top of that, there's also an element that is targeting agricultural sustainability, and in that context, in the context of the CRCF, so of the removal certification framework, also removals in the agricultural sector can be generated. They are called temporary, so not that durable, but they will also be targeted under the scheme in order to incentivize implementers to do more removal work and really support removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere in order to reach this overall Green Deal goal of net zero European Union in 2050.
So the US government also has a framework for carbon dioxide removals. They call it the CDR framework. And part of that also, there's discussion around, what kinds of nature-based removals are supported in the removals framework in Europe. You mentioned land use conversion. You mentioned farming practices that might be low till or no till, ways to keep the carbon in the soil. But what about, reforestation, mangrove restoration? Are those included in the European Union's carbon removal framework?
To start with the last, we don't have any mangroves close to Europe. So that is certainly not the case. Mm-hmm. So we don't have these here. In the context of the land use change and forestry framework, there's decarbonization goals and removal goals covered, and also in that context, afforestation activities. In the context of the carbon removal certification framework, which we are discussing now, forestry is not explicitly mentioned. So from the perspective of a nature-based solution, so to say, it's really only targeting agricultural solutions. And even that has been added quite lately in the let's say, legislative process. And it also has gotten quite some criticism because of that. Intentionally, and like the initial proposal, which was issued by the European Commission, really only entailed long-term, durable, technical removals as the ones that I just mentioned, like direct air capture, biochar, and bioenergy, carbon capture and storage.
Mm-hmm. So for these removal credits, where can they be generated? Are they only generated in the European Union, or can they be generated around the world and used in this European framework?
Yeah, that's been defined quite clearly. So it's really a mechanism within the borders of the European Union. So even not Switzerland would be part of that framework as it is at the moment. So it's within the European Union, and the removals generated have to contribute to the European NDC. So to the national determined contributions that the European Union has basically issued and communicated in the context of the Paris Agreement. And that is its exclusive purpose at the moment. And therefore, generation of decarbonization units or CDR units for that framework have to take place also within the European Union.
Yeah. Interesting. And so how do you see the demand and interest in carbon removals be stimulated or impacted by this framework?
I would expect this to have quite an impact, because many of the technologies, especially the ones that we are looking at here, biochar, bioenergy, carbon capture and storage, direct air capture, is quite a pioneering technology at the moment. It's still quite expensive, and you can drive down these prices, of course, by scale. On the other hand, if there is a clear demand, it will certainly stimulate a lot of producers to do exactly that, to really find solutions, how to implement these kind of activities, as the demand is basically quite clear, right? So it will contribute to the decarbonization framework. How it is then in detail about which channels you might sell them and into which sectors, that's not quite figured out at the moment. But I'm expecting, since this is really targeting the demand side of removals, that this will certainly stimulate the supply market and really motivate many players to invest in such solutions.
And when we think about, as you mentioned, a lot of those technology-driven carbon removals are very expensive. Will the removal credits be, capped at the EU ETS price, the, cap and trade program, or do we think they could be significantly more expensive than that scheme?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think also like the fungibility between these mechanisms is not quite clarified yet. So on the timelines, looking forward, this is really something that I think is scheduled now for 2026 to really look at how carbon removals generated in the European Union can basically, for example, swapped with EU emission allowances on the other hand or other way around. So that is not quite clear. And well, the price for European Union allowances under the EU ETS is also quite volatile, right? So it really is a supply and demand mechanism, mainly depending on the economic performances of the companies covered under this scheme. And yeah, it has been showing prices almost close to 100 euro already, not very long time ago. And now, since the economic performance in the European region has slowed down quite a bit since a couple of months, the prices also went down quite significantly to 60 euro. And so that's quite a bridge to gap, right? And apparently, if this price volatility would apply also to more project-based initiatives that might be hard to handle. So the impact on prices and how these interact is not quite clear at the moment. I think for investors, it's really important to have clarity on the cost, of course, on the one hand. So really striving for the lowest possible production cost, but also on some certainty, of course, on the price that can be achieved. If looking at science, right, what it tells us where carbon prices would need to be by the end of the decade and even beyond, we certainly need increasing prices in order to really reach the Paris goals and the Paris decarbonization goals. And in that context, one can certainly count with higher prices than the UTS has at the moment.
Yeah, I think that there's been a few different studies around what that carbon price would need to be, right? And it needs to be above $100. And I think I've seen $130, something like that, as kind of an indicative price of what we would need to drive down the emissions and create those incentives to reduce.
As a global average, right?
But I think, the Paris Agreement also outlined that a lot of countries can't afford that.
That's why I'm saying it's a global average, and there will be regions with higher prices exactly because of that reason, and also because, of course, the costs of implementing measures are different. They are higher here in Europe and the US, higher than in other parts of the world, higher than in the global south. And that's basically also part of this entire idea, right, of generating emission reductions and removals in parts of the world where the generation costs are simply not that high, but you achieve the same emission reduction for less money. And for me, it still makes a lot of sense, right? This is how we started, or I at least started in this job, by being fascinated this kind of thinking and also market mechanism behind, and this global cooperation element, of course. So yeah, but taking up your last comment, I think if that holds true, we could even expect higher prices in the European Union than this 130 global average, if reaching basically the 1.5 degrees or the 2 degrees is really what we are aiming for as a society and on policy level.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned that the European economy is in a bit of a downturn currently, and that's driven the price of the emissions trading scheme lower from $100 to $60. How are, our companies, our corporations talking about the cost of this program, and are there complaints?
Yeah, I think, well, this is a bit of the German perspective now,
Mm.
but Germany is quite suffering under this economic downturn. It has to do a lot with the export nature of our economy. So we are depending a lot on a working global economy. And apparently it has been disturbed quite significantly in Europe, but also globally in the latest years. So I think of course, anything that adds costs or complexity is something that companies not necessarily like. But the greatest problem that we have in Germany is not the price on carbon. It's more the bureaucracy and other elements that make it difficult to run a business in Germany and also in parts of the European Union. We have a problem with labor, We have a lot of many open jobs. We have, as I said, a high tax burden, and we have a lot of bureaucracy. So those are the greater problems, I would say, for the economy in Germany, but also in other parts here of the European Union. The carbon costs are, of course, adding to costs. But you already mentioned, for example, the CBAM mechanism. That is really a mechanism that is trying to do two things, I would say. One is disincentivizing companies from leaving the European Union because of carbon costs on the one hand, but also providing a bit of course, a fair or level playing field for products that are, or for companies that are in strong international competition with their product. So whatever carbon price you add here for a ton of steel, for example, would have to be added either in the host country where this product has been produced, or if not, then added by the CBAM mechanism, which is basically adding that specific carbon costs in order to enter the European Union. And that is really, it's a tariff, exactly. Yeah. And it's also variable. It really depends on the carbon price in the European Union at this moment for the specific project. It's really implemented in order to avoid that there are any, let's say, disadvantages to the businesses that are in heavy competition internationally, and that would in theory be punished by additional costs due to climate action in the European Union. And since we want climate action, but do not want to punish our industry, that mechanism is certainly quite helping to provide such level playing field as I just mentioned.
Yeah, and that's rolling out in phases as well. Is that correct? They're, addressing some initial industries and then adding industries over time?
Exactly. There's an initial phase which has started in 2023, and it's lasting 3 years, so until and including 2026. And it covers a few products like, I think, iron, steel, aluminium, fertilizers, like these. It's basically products, as I said, that we import where there's a strong price competition and where there's also a real risk, because usually we traditionally have a strong steel industry, for example. But if we would put single-sidedly these carbon tax costs or these carbon tariff costs on our industry, there's a great incentive for them to leave. And that's what this mechanism is about to avoid, right? And yes, after 2026, it will fully apply to all companies that are covered under the ETS and all sectors.
Super interesting. Well, I really appreciate your time today, Wolfgang, to help us understand a bit more about the European carbon frameworks, the removals framework, the emissions trading scheme, and the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, CBAM. Apologies to those listening if we use some acronyms. We tried to explain them a couple of times throughout, but there's just a lot of long named programs that we were discussing. So I really appreciate your time and look forward to the next conversation.
Thank you very much, Erika.
Whether you're a seasoned ESG practitioner or embarking on your sustainability journey, ESG Decoded is your trusted source for inspiration and actionable insights for responsible business practices. Subscribe on your favorite streaming platforms to be notified of new episodes drop bi-weekly on Tuesday mornings, and connect with us at ESG Decoded on social media or by visiting www.climeco.com.